Senator Warren.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Marcus, if confirmed, you would be responsible for protecting the civil rights of American students at a time when Nazis and white supremacists are marching across college campuses with tiki torches, and many young people are literally afraid to go to school because of the hateful climate that has been fostered by Donald Trump. If confirmed, will you commit to fully enforcing civil rights laws and protecting all students from discrimination and harassment?
Yes.
Good. So I just want to find out a little more detail about what that commitment means to you, and I thought we might go through a few fact situations. So let's start with an easy one. Say there's a school district that has some mostly white schools and some mostly black schools, and let's say that the mostly black schools have less experienced teachers, teachers with fewer qualifications. Those schools have fewer books, they have fewer computers in the library, fewer AP courses available. By any objective measure, those schools have clearly been shortchanged. If confirmed, would your office step in to protect the civil rights of that district's black students?
If I were confirmed, I would ensure that any complaints alleging violation of Title VI would be
Mr. Marcus,
reviewed.
I don't want to start a dance here. This is a set of facts. They come to you in your position if you are confirmed. And my question is, are those facts adequate? Will you step in to protect the civil rights of the district's black students?
Senator, I would certainly hope to be able to provide protection for the civil rights of those black students to the extent possible under law.
But that's the question I'm asking, how you see this. You're allowed to answer hypotheticals here, so this one should be easy, a yes or a no. Would you step in on those facts or not?
I appreciate that, Senator, but unfortunately in my experience, the cases that OCR deals with are much more complicated than...
So you don't think that's enough evidence, what I've just said?
I think I would need to look at it very carefully.
Mr. Marcus, we have to move on, but I actually started with an easy one. Last year, the Office of Civil Rights investigated exactly that situation in Toledo, Ohio, and it forced the school district to ensure that students have equal resources. That's the job of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education, the job that you are asking for here. So let me try another one. Given the climate of fear and uncertainty that Donald Trump has created for dreamers, if a school said, we're happy to enroll all 5-year-olds in kindergarten, but kids who can't prove that they are citizens will be barred at the door, would your office step in to protect the civil rights of those students from discrimination?
Well, to my ear, Senator, that sounds like a violation of law, but I don't know whether it would be a violation of one of the laws over which OCR has jurisdiction. There are certain rules here that would fall under the Equal Protection Clause. We would step in if I were confirmed if there is a violation of one of OCR's statutes.
So I'm a little surprised to hear you split it that way. The Supreme Court ruled in Plyer versus Doe that this type of discrimination would clearly be an unconstitutional violation of the 14th Amendment. Are you saying that your office wouldn't step in to enforce that?
Well, Senator, I suppose there's a question about the jurisdiction of the Department of Education to deal with issues under the Equal Protection Clause, but generally speaking, the Office for Civil Rights has jurisdiction over statutes like Title VI, but has not, to my knowledge, been granted the authority to enforce the Equal Protection Clause per se.
I'm shocked by that answer. The job that you are applying for here is to enforce civil rights protections and to be the advocate in the Department of Education for exactly that job. And you can say, if you think you need help from the Department of Justice in that, it would be a perfectly reasonable answer to say, I'll bring in the Department of Justice and we'll work together on this. But the idea that you would, what I'm hearing you say is, I would take a pass on this, or might take a pass, gives me a great deal of concern. You know, I've just given you 2 hypotheticals. I'm going to do more in writing. I want to be respectful of the time here. But I don't think we need someone in this position whose view of civil rights enforcement is to do as little as possible to protect as few students as possible. I think that would be bad for students overall, and with Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education, I think it would be even worse. So thank you, Madam Chairman, or Chairwoman.
Did you want to respond, Mr. Marcus?
If I may, Madam Chair, thank
Yes.
you. Thank you, Senator Warren, for those questions, and I would like to clarify, because if confirmed, my position would be the opposite. My position would be that I would want to ensure that the Office for Civil Rights enforces civil rights laws to the maximum extent permissible within the law. Now, in the hypothetical that you mentioned, it seems to me that there may or may not be a situation in which the Department of Justice has a role in these. That would not be my call. It is my understanding that when the Department of Education interacts with the Department of Justice, it is typically through the Office of General Counsel. Now, if the Office of General Counsel had an issue with justice that pertains to civil rights, I would certainly be pleased to work with colleagues to sort out what the appropriate steps should be.
So if I could, just for a few seconds, and I recognize we're over time here, Madam Chair, but this is my concern. These positions are positions of judgment. And what we're really looking for is, what is your inclination here? Is your inclination to say, I want to go in, I want to raise this set of issues, and ultimately to say, I'm willing, I recognize the court may have to decide this at some point, but I see my job as to act on behalf of the students. I've given you two cases that I think legally are quite clear. And what I'm hearing from you is that you're tepid on this, and that just gives me concern in this space, and I should quit. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So after the 2008 financial crisis, Congress created the Financial Stability Oversight Council in order to monitor the risks in the financial system, and one of FSOC's main duties is to, quote, identify gaps in regulation that could pose risks to the financial stability of the United States. Now, Mr. Secretary, you're the head of FSOC. Despite that role, you appear to support a bill that this committee has passed that would roll back the rules on banks between $50 billion and $250 billion in assets. That's about 30 of the 40 largest banks in this country. So what I want to understand today is why you're so confident that that wouldn't pose a risk to the financial stability of the country. So, Mr. Secretary, how much do these 30 banks hold collectively in assets, deposits, securities, and so on?
Well, first of all, I think that we have very significant regulators that will continue to regulate.
But that's not my question.
Banks.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary. I'm just asking you a straightforward question. We're talking about changing the rules.
Yes.
That 30 of the 40 largest financial institutions would lose their designation, automatic designation, as systemically significant financial institutions. And I'm just asking you, that 30, how much do they collectively hold in assets?
It's a large number.
A large number.
You have it. I don't have it in front of me.
How about
but
$4 trillion?
It is a large number.
How about $4 trillion? Does that sound about right?
That's correct.
Okay, and that's about what portion of the GDP?
Again, that's
about
higher.
A quarter of the entire GDP. During the 2008 financial crisis, do you know how much the taxpayers had to pay out in bailout money to those 30 of the 40 largest banks in the country in order to keep them up and floating?
Again, I assume you have that number there too, but so I don't have it in front of me.
It's $50 billion, nearly $50 billion. So I'm a little surprised that as the head of FSOC and the Secretary of the Treasury, that you would support a bill without knowing how much you're actually reducing the regulation on it in these giant financial institutions. These banks hold the equivalent of about a quarter of the entire economy. They got $50 billion in bailout money less than a decade ago, and yet you think we can roll back, reduce our oversight of them now. So let me ask, do you think that these $50 billion to $250 billion banks can't pose a risk to the financial system?
Again, there could be banks, okay, that do pose a risk and could be designated. The purpose of this is many of those banks are large community, regional banks that don't.
I'm sorry,
that don't
are you
pose,
saying that a bank of $200 billion is a community
No, that's
bank?
what I'm saying. I'm saying they're regional banks, okay?
And are you saying regional banks can't pose a risk to the financial
No,
system?
I didn't say that. What I said is that many of those banks don't. Okay, this is something that I believe there is bipartisan support for.
And my understanding is
again, I think
if they don't pose a risk, you can always alter under the current rules how you regulate them. The question is the immediate designation so that you keep them on the watch list. You know, it's clear to me that these banks do pose a risk to the economy, and that's the reason that Congress said they should be on a watch list. But let me take a specific example. In the years leading up to the financial crisis, Countrywide Financial issued 1 out of every 5 mortgages in the country. It did more subprime and teaser rate mortgages than almost anyone, and it turned around and sold them to Wall Street banks. It basically created all these grenades, pulled the pins out, threw them into our economy, and helped blow up the American economic system. At the height of its impact on the financial system, about 18 months before the crash, Countrywide was a $200 billion bank, which is actually smaller than some of the banks that would be deregulated by this bill. So my question is, Mr. Secretary, why would you be so eager to take these banks off the watch list, to deregulate it and make it easier for them to follow whatever practices they want to follow?
First of all, Senator, I share your concerns about Countrywide. I think there was lots of mistakes that went on there, particularly with the mortgages that they underwrote, and lots of blame to go around. Again, we believe that these entities below this side can be regulated by their primary regulators. But let me just say, this is something that requires bipartisan support, and it's up for Congress to decide whether they want to raise the limits.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, but as I understand it, you have been pushing on raising the rate, raising the level from $50 billion to $250 billion. If you think that means that we will be taking on more risk in the system, and I think that's what it means, I wish you would tell us so. You know, the banks have record profits right now. They are rolling in money. They just got a giant tax giveaway. They've got even more money. They do not need another chance to blow up this economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So after the financial crisis, Congress determined that banks with more than $50 billion in assets, this is about the roughly 40 biggest banks in the country, posed a greater risk to the economy than community banks and credit unions. And so we required the Federal Reserve to apply tougher rules and more oversight to those banks. And now those banks want to eliminate the $50 billion threshold. They want to cut all but the very biggest banks loose from stricter oversight. And they want to restrict the federal regulators from applying tougher rules except under somewhat more limited circumstances. So in other words, this is about rolling back a big part of Dodd-Frank. And I just want to take a look at that. Mr. Simmons, you're the CEO of Zions Bank, which is one of the banks that would avoid tougher rules under the industry's proposal. And in your written testimony, you argue that the current approach covers too many banks, given the minimal risks posed by banks like yours, and that we're unnecessarily making it harder for banks like yours to lend. Do I have that about right? Yeah, okay. Now, those arguments sounded very familiar to me, so I went back and looked, and it turns out that back in September of 2006, just 2 years before the financial crisis, you were the head of Zions Bank, and you testified before the House Financial Services Committee. Your testimony strongly opposed guidance from federal regulators that increased the oversight for banks that had a high concentration of commercial real estate loans. Regulators were worried that the banks were overly exposed to one category of lending, and that might put them at greater risk of failing. You thought, there's no problem. And in opposing the guidance, I want to quote you on this, you said, the guidance has been proposed at a time when the banking industry is exceptionally healthy. Another one from you in this testimony, commercial real estate loans in particular have performed exceptionally well. Another one, by using blanket industry-wide guidance to address concentrations, the regulators risk choking off the flow of credit from banks that are engaging in commercial real estate lending in a safe, sound, and profitable manner. Now, within 2 years of your testimony, the bank you led, Zions, needed nearly $1.5 billion in taxpayer bailout money to stay afloat. And here's the kicker. That was in part because your bank was highly concentrated in commercial real estate lending, the exact thing that you told Congress was not an issue, nothing to worry about. So, Mr. Simmons, when you say today that Congress can safely roll back the rules on banks like yours and there won't be any risks to taxpayers, why should anyone believe you?
Well, listen. What we're saying is that the enhanced prudential standards in Section 165 of Dodd-Frank are industrial strength intended, in my way of thinking about this, for institutions that pose...
Mr. Simmons, let me stop you right there, because I know we're really trying to do this quickly. I'm not asking you to repeat your argument. We've already agreed on what your argument is. The question I'm asking, given your previous testimony about how there's no problem here, and then it turned out you needed $1.5 billion in bailout money on exactly the thing you testified was not a problem. I'm asking why anybody should believe you when you come in here today and say, no problem in this area, let the $50 billion and above banks go ahead. I'm just trying to understand why you have any credibility on this issue.
Well, listen, because I deal with it every day.
Well, you dealt with it every day back when you testified in 2006, and the taxpayers had to pony up $1.5 billion to save your bank.
Listen, every large bank took TARP money.
I'm sorry. So your argument is that you were right or wrong?
No, the one large bank that didn't receive it, National City, was sold a week later. This was a matter of preserving confidence across the industry. Our capital, our equity capital, always remained above the regulatory minimums.
I'm sorry, Mr. Simmons. Are you trying to make the argument that you didn't have a problem? You know, because actually...
We encouraged stress, but we never saw equity capital, common equity capital decline below the regulatory minimums.
The regulators actually went back in 2013 to re-examine their earlier guidance, the guidance you'd said was unnecessary, and they found, quote, during the 3-year economic downturn, banks with high commercial real estate concentration levels proved to be far more susceptible to failure. Specifically, 23% of the banks that were highly concentrated in commercial real estate lending, what you had testified about, failed, compared with only 0.5% of the banks that weren't. So I understand we're out of time. I just want to say here, you know, what I notice about this is whenever things are going okay, the banks come in here and say, yay, let's reduce the rules, let's let everybody go out. What could possibly go wrong? And then when things go wrong, banks like yours line up and say to the taxpayers, bail me out. Our job is to make sure that we do not permit the next failure to happen because it helps short-term bank profits. Our job is to watch out for the taxpayers and the security of this economy.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the high cost of prescription drugs is a huge problem. Let's talk about the best way to tackle this public health crisis. Ms. Riley, your association, which is called PhRMA, represents brand name drug companies, and you said in your testimony that, quote, the competitive market is the engine that drives the drug industry. So I take it you think that market solutions are the most effective way to deal with the rising price of drugs.
I do believe that markets lower costs, yes.
Good. I love markets, and I also believe in market-based solutions. So let's talk about one of the best market-based solutions, and that's competition. If the restrictions that prevent purchasers from importing the exact same drugs at lower prices from places like Canada were removed, we'd see some real competition and we'd see some lower prices. Another market solution is negotiation. If the federal government were allowed to negotiate more competitive drug prices for Medicare beneficiaries, then prices would come down. So, Ms. Riley, you've already said that pharma opposes importation of drugs from Canada. Let me ask about letting the federal government negotiate with drug companies over Medicare prices, these two market-based solutions.
Well, I would argue price controls are not a market-based solution. When foreign
I'm sorry, I didn't ask about price controls. I asked about bringing in drugs that
bringing
would
in
compete
drugs
with
from
prices
other
here.
countries that price control their products is not a market-based way to get to drug prices.
So you would be in favor of drug importation from any place that's not doing what you call price control?
I would argue that almost every country outside of the U.S.
So there's no place
artificially
that we could
limits
import
prices.
from that would
Artificially limits
satisfy
prices.
your requirements. How about the federal government competing and actually having some competition and saying we're going to negotiate prices?
I think there's often a fallacy that because the federal government is not setting prices in Medicare, that there's not negotiation, and that couldn't be further from the truth. As we've seen in the Medicare Part D program, there's been robust negotiation. Rebates are over 35% on average in Part D.
So you're
Premiums
for,
have been low.
let me just stop you there. So I just want to make sure I understand the point of the group that you represent here and lobby for, and that is it that the federal government ought to be able to negotiate all drug prices?
No, we don't believe the federal government's in the best position. We have rapid market consolidation in the pharmacy benefit manager space that exerts significant pressure to the tune of over $100 billion in rebates last year.
I understand that you have other concerns, but, drug competition from Canada, price negotiation are market solutions. They're not government mandates, and I would have thought that if you believe in market solutions, you would have embraced them.
Well, I don't believe that price controls are market-based solutions, and I also think that you need to look at the downsides that happen in those countries, which is patients don't get the kind of access that they get to therapies here in the United States.
I realize that you can call it price controls, but this is a real question of whether or not there's any place else for consumers to go to purchase drugs, or whether or not the federal government can negotiate on a drug-by-drug basis every time taxpayers are picking up the ticket.
Well, the Congressional Budget Office has looked at this.
And the organizations who are testifying here today spent a combined total of $30 million lobbying Congress last year. Pharma, your organization, is responsible for almost 3/4 of that total, and a lot of that money that is spent lobbying Congress is to keep drug prices high. That's what improves profitability for your industry and the companies you represent. And here's what I think is really wrong about this. You talk about wanting market solutions, but your industry isn't based on competitive markets. It's based on totally artificial, taxpayer-granted monopolies. Companies invent new drugs, and then the government hands the companies the exclusive right to manufacture and sell those drugs at whatever prices they want for decades. So I just have a little bit of time left. But I want to ask, do you know the average length of a government-granted monopoly for top-selling drugs in this country?
10 to 12 years.
Yeah, 10 to 12 years. The law says 5.
No.
5 years of exclusivity, but drug companies game the system. According to a 2015 analysis by researchers at Harvard, companies end up with a monopoly that lasts a medium length of 12 and a half years.
Senator Warren, patents are 20 years long.
Mr. Chairman.
20 years. That is how long a pharmaceutical patent is. We also have 5 years of data exclusivity.
The law says 5 years of exclusivity on the basic drugs.
Absolutely.
And the average, you think the Harvard study, they don't know how to do it there to study how much money you're making off these things or how long you have exclusivity?
Senator Warren, I'm simply saying that companies have 5 years of data exclusivity. Immediately after that, a generic company can get to market. And let me tell you, they try very hard to get to market as soon as they can.
And you're saying that the drug companies don't game the system at all to expand their exclusivity to an average of 12 and a half years. It just happens.
Senator Warren, patents are 20 years long. Exclusivity is a completely different issue.
Try the story on someone else who's going to be willing to listen to it. Taxpayers watch. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You can finish your...
No. I just wanted to say, taxpayers watch when we've granted exclusivity to these companies, and then they watch as the prices go up, and there's not a darn thing for taxpayers to do about it. This is just fundamentally wrong. So I want to go back to your remarks about Glass-Steagall. As you know, the original Glass-Steagall was put in place to divide commercial banks and investment banks. The law was repealed in 1999, which created the too big to fail banks, like Citigroup and J.P. Morgan Chase that got so large. And since then, there have been many proposals, including my own bipartisan bill with Senators McCain, Cantwell, and King for a 21st century Glass-Steagall that would break up the banks and modernize the wall between commercial banking and investment banking. Now, I want to look at the history of this. The president and this administration have said repeatedly that they support a 21st century Glass-Steagall. It was in the Republican Party platform. Donald Trump said it specifically a few weeks before the election. You said, quote, "We need a 21st century Glass-Steagall" at your confirmation hearing. And now you've just said exactly the opposite. You know, in the past few months, you and the president have had a number of meetings with big bank CEOs and lobbyists. Is that the reason for the reversal on Glass-Steagall?
No, not at all. And there actually wasn't a reversal. So
wasn't a reversal?
No, let me just explain. So the Republican platform did have Glass-Steagall. We, during the campaign, and I had the opportunity to work with the president on this, specifically came out and said we do support a 21st century Glass-Steagall.
Yes.
That means that there are aspects of it, okay, that we think may make sense. But we never said before that we supported a full separation of banks and investment banks.
I'm sorry.
If we had said that, we would have.
Let me just stop you right there, Mr. Secretary.
You're not letting me finish.
Yeah, I'm not, because I really have to understand what you've just said. There are aspects of Glass-Steagall that you support, but not breaking up the banks and separating commercial banking from investment banking. What do you think Glass-Steagall was, if that's not right at the heart of it?
Again, I'm well aware of what Glass-Steagall was. And as you may know, the original concern about Glass-Steagall was actually about conflicts, not about credit risk. And if we had supported a full Glass-Steagall, we would have said at the time that we believed in Glass-Steagall, not a 21st century Glass-Steagall. We were very clear in differentiating it. Now, I now realize that I had not realized that your bill was named the 21st century.
Yes, and has been for 3 years now.
I apologize that I was not aware of that. So we were.
But I still haven't heard the answer to my question. What do you think Glass-Steagall was if it wasn't separating commercial banking from investment bank, from ordinary banking?
Again, the fundamental part of Glass-Steagall was, as you've just outlining, the separation of investment banking from commercial banking, because people were concerned about conflicts.
How do you separate without breaking up the big banks that have integrated these two things?
Again, the integration of commercial banking and investment banks has gone on for a long period of time. That is not what caused the problems during the financial crisis. And if we did go back to a full separation, you would have an enormous impact on liquidity and lending to small and medium-sized businesses.
Let me get this straight. You're saying that you are in favor of Glass-Steagall, which breaks apart the two arms of banking, regular banking and commercial banking, except you don't want to break apart the two parts of banking. This is like something straight out of George Orwell. You're saying simultaneously you're in favor of breaking up the banks. That's what Glass-Steagall is.
I've never said we're in favor of breaking up the banks and separating. If we had, it would have been very simple.
Let me try it one more time. We're going to run out of time here, but I have to try this one more time. What does it mean to be in favor of 21st century Glass-Steagall if it does not mean breaking apart these two functions in banking?
You know what? I'd be more than happy to come see you and follow up and talk about this.
Just tell me what it means.
Had we never came out
and tell me what it means
we should separate.
Tell me what 21st century Glass-Steagall means if it doesn't mean breaking apart those two functions. It's an easy question or an impossible question.
It's actually a complicated question because there's many aspects of it. Okay, the simple answer, which we don't support, is breaking up banks from investment banks. We think that would be a huge mistake. But again, I'm more than happy to listen to your ideas on it. You obviously have strong views, and I'd be happy to follow up and listen to you.
This is just bizarre. The idea that you can say we are in favor of Glass-Steagall but not breaking up the
We
big
never
banks.
said we
Thank
were in
you.
favor of Glass-Steagall. We said we were in favor of a 21st century Glass-Steagall. It couldn't be clearer.
We are in favor of a bill that is called breaking up the banks, only don't break up the banks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is crazy.
Senator Tillis.